All right, so again, we're gonna wrap up a few things in chapter 5 first before we move on to Acts chapter 6. So, so far as we've been going through the book of Acts, one of the themes that's really come out is this theme of unity amongst the church, right? And we've seen so far that there were needy members amongst the congregation in Jerusalem. And we've seen people like Barnabas a few chapters ago who are selling their possessions and bringing the money to the apostles for them to distribute. And you'll remember, kind of as recap here for chapter 5, what Ananias and Sapphira did, right? So they see the recognition that these people are getting for their good works, and so they want that recognition for themselves, but they don't actually want to make good on the sale of their property and actually give it all away. So they lie about their actions, and they're punished in this very swift and severe manner. And so people see that, right, and there's great fear upon the church when they see this happen. But as we go through chapter 5, the apostles go on, and they're doing signs and wonders, and the number of believers is growing. So that's another theme that we've seen so far through Acts, right, is that incredible growth in spite of some persecution that they're already experiencing. And once again, in this chapter, in chapter 5, the Sadducees see this happening, and they're jealous, and so they arrest the apostles once again, and they put them in prison, as they've already done once before. But this time, as opposed to chapter 4, what happens in that imprisonment, in this chapter, there's a miraculous escape, right? So we talked about the fact that an angel comes and lets them out, and they go back to the temple and they resume preaching. And when that happens, they go the next morning to let them out, and they get there, and the doors are locked, and the doors are closed, and they open them, and they're not there. And so they don't understand what's happened, and then they get word, actually, they're back in the temple preaching the same as they were. And so once again, they go, and they bring them out of the temple, and they once again bring them in front of this council. And again, it says, not by force, for they were afraid of being stoned by the people. And so you get kind of these hints that maybe there's some respect developing for the apostles and the work that they're doing, right? They realize that they're losing public support, and so they can't go and just strong-arm these people and march them back to the council because they see the popularity that they're getting amongst the people. And similar to previous times, they once again tell the apostles not to teach, and the apostles give the same answer that we saw back in chapter 4. I called it kind of civil disobedience, right? They acknowledge, yes, we hear your instructions, we hear what you're telling us to do, but as Peter's already said, we can't help but talk about the things that we've seen and we've heard. We must obey God rather than men. So let's pick up here in verse 33, and we'll finish out the rest of this chapter before we move on to chapter 6. So in verse 33 it says, when they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. When they heard what? When they heard the apostles say that we're going to continue to do what we feel compelled to do. So if you look back at verse 28 in this chapter, the Sadducees claimed that the apostles, quote, intend to bring this man's blood upon us, talking about Jesus. And was that their intent? Pretty clearly, yes. In verse 30, Peter, when he's replying to this council, he refers to Jesus, comma, whom you killed, right? So he's not making any, he's not hedging this indictment at all. And we talked last week and the week before about the fact that these Jewish leaders seem to grasp the seriousness of the charges that the apostles are laying against them. We talked about in chapter 4, this reference back to Psalms where Peter says that they were the builders who rejected the stone, which became the chief cornerstone, right? So not only did they kill Jesus, but when they did that, they actually fulfilled the very prophecy that they were supposed to know. And so you get this idea that they're increasingly understanding the implications of the things that the apostles are saying. And you remember back in chapter 4 that not only does Peter say that, but he makes the claim that there's no other name by which they could be saved. And so there's this idea that there's going to require some repentance if they're going to be saved, because this Jesus, who's the only way to salvation, is the one that they crucified, the one that they didn't recognize as the chief cornerstone. And so again, verse 33, they hear us, they become enraged and want to kill him. But there was one guy who kind of pumps the brakes. So let's read in verse 34, starting in verse 34 of chapter 5. Then one in the council stood up, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in respect by all the people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. And he said to them, men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. And now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God. So here's the argument that Gamaliel makes. He says, there were these two guys, you all remember them, Theudas and Judas. These two guys, they were Jews who tried this before, right? Who tried to rise up against what we teach and what we profess. And look what happened to them, right? So there's only two options. Either these apostles, just like those two guys, will kind of come to nothing, or if not, they're from God and there's really nothing that we can do about it. We'll lose that argument regardless. So I've got some thoughts about this. So does anybody have any thoughts about what Gamaliel says here? Does anybody have thoughts about his logic or have comments about his logic? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so he's accurately describing the past and what's happened. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if he's referring to the apostles or to Jesus, but I hear your thought. I don't know. Any other? Yes, ma'am. Mm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Very. Right. Harry, do you have a thought? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mike. Gamaliel. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I think it's also interesting, and this is a kind of a zag, but I think at face value, his argument has a lot of validity to it, and he certainly seems more cool-headed and less emotional as these people around him. But on the other hand, he allows the possibility that Jesus might just be some other Jew, right? And was Jesus some other Jew claiming to be somebody? No, of course not. And so the fact that in spite of the things that Jesus did and said and that he knew about, that he still allows for the possibility that maybe Jesus is just some other guy, just like Judas and this other guy. So I'm not sure it's a great comparison that he makes, although I think he is certainly more cool-headed in the midst of this anger and fury and the plotting to kill him. Yeah, Mike. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. There's almost a sense of like a wait and see argument, right? And that's another thing that kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth in the sense that, Jesus, when he would preach, didn't allow for this position of neutrality, right? You think about whoever's not with me is against me. And so this idea of kind of maintaining a position of neutrality and a wait and see isn't something that Christ really allowed for when he taught. So I don't know. I think he certainly stands out in contrast to the other people that we see here, especially given the idea, as you mentioned, that he's a Pharisee. And for most of what we've seen so far in Acts, it's not been the Pharisees that have been challenging the apostles, really the Sadducees. And so the fact that he had such authority even amongst this group who kind of had some disagreements with to begin with is telling. Right. Right. So let's look here at verse 40. So in verse 40 it says, "And when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus." So the rest of this council falls in line and says, okay, we'll beat them this time and let them go. And you see the response of Peter and the apostles, that they're rejoicing, they're celebrating the fact that they're suffering on behalf of Jesus. We won't turn there now, but in the book we call First Peter, Peter's going to write and talk about this idea of suffering and the joy that should accompany suffering. That it's really a blessing. This is from 1 Peter 4. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God. And so we see certainly Peter living that out here in front of the council. The last thing I'll say from this chapter before we move on is the thing that stood out to me is here in verse 42. It says, "And every day in the temple and from house to house they did not cease teaching and preaching." We've talked so far about Acts, about wanting to live like these first century Christians and be the way that they did, live the way that they did. Do I teach on a daily basis? Just some self-reflection and application for us. Is this something I do on a daily basis? Like we see these apostles after they've been beaten and held on trial, basically. Any thoughts on Acts 5 before we move on? Yeah, Dan.
None of us would do that. How these men were told, don't talk about people. And I think there's a lot of power. It kind of tied into what we were saying before. This gathering, this uprising, is getting.
Yeah.
Nothing that's so far that
Right. Their boldness is unparalleled, right? In terms of, as we've seen so far in Acts, their persistence and courage, right, in spite of trial after trial and now being beaten. Totally agree. Let's look at. Let's move on to chapter 6. This is a shorter chapter. So this is kind of a shift in that we're going to shift gears a little bit, and Luke is going to start describing some of the things happening within the church. So far we've been talking primarily about persecution from the outside, and now we're going to see some struggles within the church. And this is kind of the first part of this chapter is really a struggle kind of at an organizational level with respect to the church. The church back then was the same as the church today in the sense that we come from all different backgrounds, right? We come from all different walks of life, different cultures, even different countries. Sometimes we speak different languages. And when you bring people together with that much diversity, there will be some conflict from time to time. And that's what we're going to see bear out here in the first part of chapter 6, right? So you recall that like back in Acts 2, people had come from all over the known world for Pentecost, and when all these folks were added to the church, a lot of them stayed, and so you've got just tremendous diversity within this group. And so let's see what problems this presents. So verse 1, it says, "Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution." So you see right here out of the onset of this chapter that this is related to growth, right? So in these days when the disciples were increasing in number. So let's point out that this is a good problem to have, right? That the church is growing, and this is one of the consequences of the growth. And we've already talked, today and in previous classes about the fact that you've got Christians who are trying to meet the needs of other Christians within the church. People are coming and selling property. They're bringing the money to the apostles. And remember, this is what Ananias and Sapphira kind of got in trouble for because of their greed. And it's important to remember that at this point, we don't have any Gentile converts. So all of these people within the church in Jerusalem were of a Jewish background. There were no Gentiles. But even then, there were different types of Jews. So there were kind of native Hebrews. Anybody think of somebody that describes himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews? Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, so someone who lived, who was very familiar with the Jewish culture, oftentimes was from around Jerusalem, had maybe grown up there or lived there at some point, who spoke Aramaic. So someone very kind of local and tied into the traditions of the Jewish people. In contrast to people who were Hellenists. So Hellenist just means folks, Jews that were from a Greek background. So they probably spoke Greek, and they might have spoken another language from their home country. Remember when we were talking back in Acts chapter 2, you had these people who came from all over the known world. I had to write down some of the countries because I can't remember them, but Pamphylia, Phrygia, Parthia, Medes. So you have people coming from all over the known world who came to Jerusalem. They were not as intimately familiar with kind of the Jewish culture and customs. And so these were Hellenistic Jews, so they were from areas far from Jerusalem. And a lot of these people had stayed in Jerusalem and were now part of the church. And we're talking about differences in how the widows from these two groups were treated. So we won't turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5, but in that passage, Paul goes through that, what the church's relationship was supposed to be with people who were widows. So he goes into great detail. A widow is someone who has lost her spouse. He calls them a widow indeed, so someone who's over the age of 60. She doesn't have someone to take care of her. She has godly children. He goes through all these specifications about what describes a widow of this sort. And the Holy Spirit, through Paul in this chapter, says that this is the church's responsibility to help take care of these people. They don't have someone to help them take care of them, and so this is the church's responsibility. I don't think it's presumptuous to say that in the first century they didn't have social safety net programs like we have today in America, right? We've got Medicare and Medicaid and WIC and TANF and all sorts of SNAP. We've got all sorts of assistance programs for people in need in our country, but presumptuously, they probably didn't have that back then. And so, if you were a widow and you didn't have children, and you didn't have other family, then you depended on other people to help provide for you. And so widows, widows in need were probably common back then because they didn't have a lot of these social safety net programs. Not to mention the fact that the church was really growing at this time. We've talked about that, right? So we've already known about several thousand of people within the church, and it's even grown since then. So it's not unreasonable to think that there were probably a lot of widows who fell within this category. And so here's the problem, that there was a perception that Christians who were formerly native Jews that their widows were being treated differently than Christians whose widows were not, who were Hellenists, who were from this kind of Greek background. And this has obviously made people within the church upset. There's no mention that this was intentional, so I think we can presume that it was probably sort of an accidental problem. There's nothing that mentions that this was deliberate. And so we'll talk about the solution that the apostles come up with, but I'm interested in your thoughts in how might this have gone wrong. And another way of asking that is, what did the apostles not do? If you've read this passage, what did they not do when they handled this? Or how could this have ended poorly? All right, they didn't make the selection themselves. So you can imagine a scenario where they say, we are going to pick some people and they're going to fix this problem, and that's our solution. You all deal with it, right? So we'll see something in contrast to that. Yeah. How else could it have gone wrong? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so they actually delegate the responsibility and take it off their own plate and leave it up to these men who have been selected to kind of own the problem. How else could it have gone wrong? Yeah, so put their head in the sand and just say, it's not worth our time. We're taking care of it. Don't worry about it. I kind of shrug it off. So you can imagine like character attacks happening against the apostles, right? So how could you let this happen? You guys are supposed to be leading this organization. How did you let something like this happen? You can imagine maybe even character attacks against the widows, saying, well, do y'all really need these things that we're bringing for you? Let's challenge the need. Is there really a need? We think we have a need, but do y'all really have as big a need as we do? You can imagine a scenario where maybe people say, well, you know what? We're just too big. We probably need to divide. We just have too many people. Operationally, this is going to be too tough to manage. Maybe we should just split into a couple of different churches. So you can imagine a couple of different scenarios how this might have played out. Let's see the solution they come up with. So verse 2, it says, and the 12 apostles summoned the full number of the disciples and said, it is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. So I think the first thing you see is some humility, right? So the apostles realize they're actually part of this problem. They've been negligent in kind of managing the situation, and they come up and say, we're too busy. We're not doing a good job here. This isn't right. This deserves attention. We should fix this. You think about all the things that they've been trying to handle between preaching and teaching and being put in prison and doing these miracles. They kind of had a lot on their plate. And in addition, they're now trying to kind of manage this distribution program for, we don't know how many widows, but for a church of several thousand. And so what do? They bring, I think this is nowhere there, they bring the full number of the disciples. So they bring everybody together, right? They're not going and speaking one group and then speaking to another group. They bring everybody together to address this problem. And they say, this needs some attention, and we're going to delegate this to some deacons. They don't use the word deacon here, but the Greek word is what we get the word deacon from. So it means servant. I don't know if this is necessarily referring to deacons in the traditional sense that we think about them from Titus and 1 Timothy, but they're servants, so we can call them servants who have been chosen to handle this. And their solution kind of exhibits this management principle, which is we as an organization will perform at the highest level if everybody is performing to the maximum of their competency, right? So this is the best analogy I could come up with. If you went to the airport and you were getting on the plane and you saw the pilots down below putting the luggage onto the airplane, and then you wait on the tarmac and you're delayed, you say, well, this doesn't make sense. Why? Is it important that luggage gets on the plane? Absolutely. This isn't to say that it's not an important job, but we should have the people who can be doing different things performing at their maximum competency. And that's kind of the solution they come up with. They look at the important work that they're doing. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And they say, there's an opportunity cost when we're having to address all these things that other men could address. So here's our solution. We're going to delegate this task. And they say, we can't neglect preaching the word to serve tables. It's important and it needs to be addressed, but we don't have the bandwidth to do it. So we're gonna find someone else that can do this work. How are we doing on time? So they say, verse 3, they say, therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty, but we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. So again, they say we have a unique work that we're doing, and they tell the church, the local congregation, to find 7 men who can take up this responsibility. I have to say I'm a little surprised there's only 7. I thought there would be a bigger number than that, but we don't know all the details. And then they give some qualifications for these men, right? They say they should have a good reputation. So what do people say about them? They say they have to be full of the Spirit, which, as best I can tell, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that this probably means that these were men who had hands laid on them by the apostles. So we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to see in Acts chapter 8 that the apostles, of course, could do all these signs and wonders, but they also had the ability to impart that to other people. And when they imparted that ability, those people could also do signs and wonders. We know later in this chapter, one of the men is going to show that he has those signs and wonders, one of the 7. So I don't know if this is when if he receives it here or if he had already received this ability. But they say they have to be full of the Spirit. And finally, they have to be full of wisdom. They have to have good judgment. They have to be good decision makers. But as was pointed out, right, who selects these men? Well, it says, pick from among you. So they tell the church, you guys come up with 7 people that meet these qualifications. And again, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that, when we think about selecting elders and deacons, we're given the qualifications in a couple of different places for what those men should look like. But to my knowledge, we don't have any example of how to select those people. My understanding is that this is the only example we have in the New Testament of how leaders were selected from within a congregation. And this was the example. It was the congregation should choose from among themselves. And then the leadership says, okay, these are the people, we're going to appoint them to do this task. I just want to mention, I think this is important, the fact that they had the congregation participate in this, because it kind of creates transparency, right? Some procedural justice. So it shows that we're not doing anything secretly or deceptively, that this isn't a transparent process because you all are helping us identify these men that meet these qualifications. So why did the apostles say it was necessary to delegate this responsibility? Look at verse 4. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. I think this is pretty remarkable that this is what they didn't want to give up. I understand the preaching of the word, but I have to admit it's kind of surprising that they state that committing themselves to prayer is a thing so worthy of their time that they need to get this off their plate. If you want evidence of how important prayer was to these early leaders in the church, here's a great example of something that they didn't want to have to sacrifice their time doing because their plate was full. And then in verse 5 it says, and what they said pleased the whole gathering. Here's the people they chose. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. So when you go through the rest of the New Testament, we don't hear about most of these guys ever again. We'll hear about Stephen and Philip, of course, but we don't hear about these other men. Nicholas was a proselyte, so we know what that means, right? He was a Gentile who had been converted to Judaism, who has now been converted to being a Christian. So here's a guy that's certainly seeking the truth. And then I think it's noteworthy, all 7 of these men had Greek names, which is kind of interesting. That here's a problem where these Grecian widows, they felt like they were the ones being neglected. And who are the people that are selected? It's Hellenistic Jews. So they go to the people who are experiencing this problem and helping enlist them to oversee the solution to it, which I think is noteworthy. Once again, kind of instilling the whole process with some transparency and openness, that they're not doing anything that's being handed down to them, but the congregation is kind of participating in the solution too. And so it says that in verse 6, they set before the apostles, and they prayed and laid their hands on them. Once again, this idea of having hands laid on means a couple of different things in the New Testament and in Acts. It's used at least 3 different ways. We've already seen it used previously in Acts chapter 4. One way, it just means if hands are laid on, it just means you were apprehended. So the Sadducees laid their hands on the apostles to apprehend them. Here, I do think it probably means that they were appointed to a task. They laid hands on them and kind of like an inauguration said, here, you're commissioned to do this work. And then as we'll get to later in Acts, we'll talk about what it means to have hands laid on as a means of imparting some special gift from the Holy Spirit. And then in verse 7 it says, and the word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. I think this is actually somewhat remarkable that we see priests being converted. We've learned of lots of different people being converted from Judaism, but you can imagine these priests who had grown up in this way of life that their service and their faith was so intimately tied to their everyday walk of life, and then here they are being converted to Christianity. So I think that's remarkable. It's easy to gloss over, but it doesn't say how many, but some of the priests are becoming obedient. So I want to zoom out and just say that if we reflect on this process, there's a problem in the church. It creates friction and stress. The apostles identify the solution. They see the need to address it, and then they appoint these men to address it. And they address it transparently and kind of in this open fashion. And as it says here, the disciples multiply greatly, so they continue to grow. Problems will always arise. You think about logistical problems that occur in the church. We need we're running out of space in our building here at this church. You think about everything that all the local churches have dealt with in the last 3 years with the pandemic. Megan and I were living in Boston, and we were meeting in a hotel conference room, and the hotel closed down. We had to meet outside. It began to snow in November. We had to go to virtual meetings. There's always going to be these kind of logistical problems that happen, and you see the importance of having leaders in place. Of course, we don't have apostles, but we have leaders within a local congregation who can kind of help direct and oversee this process. So as a follow-up to that, I'm curious, does anybody have any kind of specific principles that stand out to them that are important when you think about solving these logistical problems within a local congregation. I'm sorry? Yeah, so right. So you see the leadership delegating responsibility. They could have not done that, right? They could have said, well, we'll just do a better job. But then something would have suffered. There would have been an opportunity cost for that, right? They said, we have to preach. We need to be praying. This is important, but we just don't have the bandwidth to do it. And so they delegate it, and we see that it worked out in the long run. Right. Yeah, so the kind of the hierarchical system of delegating responsibility. It's also worth noting that, people stepped up. They didn't have a void of leadership below these apostles. There were men there who were ready to serve and accepted this challenge and took on the responsibility, which we kind of take for granted. But if you don't have that, then who's going to accept this responsibility, right? You can have leaders who are ready to delegate all day long, but if no one's going to own this problem and do the work, then it's of no value. Mm-hmm. Right, so because they delegate, ultimately the church grows because the people who are doing the preaching can still do the preaching, and so everybody, the whole organization is maximized because they're delegating and nothing's suffering because of that. Barry? Mm, right, right. I'm glad you said that because one of the first points I had, I was going to skip over it, but it's also important to note that just because we say there's a problem, it doesn't mean that there was room for improvement, but this was a function of the church growing. This was a good problem to have, right? So the fact that we call it a problem, it doesn't mean anything nefarious was going on. It was just the church was growing and the previous infrastructure wasn't working, and so they had to adapt. Yes, ma'am. Right. Right. Sure. And you can imagine how this could have been a dividing issue if the leadership hadn't known about it and people were just talking behind one another's backs and said, well, did you see what that widow got? And my widow needs this, right? It could be really create a lot of friction, but it required just addressing. Let's move on so we can finish this chapter before next Sunday because it ties in closely to what we're talking about today. So the last half of this chapter really flows directly into chapter 8, which we'll talk about, chapter 7, which we'll talk about next week. So we kind of focus in on Stephen, one of these 7 men that was appointed to do this work. So briefly, I won't reread it, but in verses 3, 5, and 8, it says that Stephen was a godly man. He was full of wisdom, he was full of the Spirit, he was full of faith, he was full of grace, and he was full of power. Stephen was a good guy. This word fullness has the idea of being controlled by. So he was controlled by wisdom and faith and grace. And we see that he had already been entrusted with some spiritual gifts from the apostles, based on what we're going to read in these next few verses. And he really gets into trouble just by doing the right thing. So read with me in verse 8. It says, And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and the Cyrenians and the Alexandrians, and of those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and disputed with Stephen. So in most cities, there was only one synagogue. You think about places like Antioch and Ephesus and Laodicea. Most of the cities in the known world at this time had one synagogue, and it's because the Jews in those cities would have been a minority. But here in Jerusalem, you have lots and lots of Jews, and so there are lots and lots of synagogues, and so they named them. So a synagogue was nothing more than where these Jews would assemble to read and study together. My understanding, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, is that this really grew out of when they were in Babylonian captivity and they couldn't go to the temple, and so they had meeting places, and that's what the synagogue was, where they would meet and they would preach and teach one another. And so so Jerusalem probably had, over 100 synagogues at the time, and they had different names. So here's Stephen, and he's at this synagogue, and he gets into a debate about Jesus with these other men. And in verse 10 it says, "But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking." So they're going back and forth and reasoning, and Stephen's winning the argument, right? He's making the points, and he has the right argument because truth was on his side. And these crowds had an opportunity to respond like we read about in Acts chapter 2, right? They could have been cut to the heart and said, "Men and brothers, what shall we do?" But they don't. What do they say? In verse 11, they secretly instigated men who said, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council. So this is their response. Let's read on verse 13 and 14. They set up false witnesses who said, "This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place in the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." We don't have time to kind of flesh this out, but there's some truth to the claims that they make, right? Christianity is different than being a Hebrew and operating under the old law. So they are going to change the customs. But the sleight of hand is that, was this blasphemous? No. And this is the case that he's going to make in the sermon that we see in the next chapter, is that, yes, there's customs we're going to change, but this was just fulfillment of prophecy, right? You go back to Deuteronomy and think about when Moses says that, God will raise up a prophet like me, meaning a prophet and a lawgiver. And the very next sentence says, "And listen to him." So, yes, it's true that some of the things he said was countercurrent to what they believed, but that doesn't mean it was blasphemous. Rather, it was fulfillment of the law. So we'll dig into that next chapter and go through kind of the sermon that Stephen makes to these people. Thanks for your attention.